I was already in bed when my phone rang. Not vibrating, not lighting up quietly on the nightstand. Ringing. That sound felt louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. I remember staring at the ceiling for a second, letting it ring longer than I normally would. I always tell myself I won't answer late calls. Nothing good ever comes from them. But I still reached for the phone. The screen was brighter than my eyes were ready for. I squinted at it, half expecting a missed call notification instead of a name. When I saw who it was, I felt that familiar pause settle in my chest. That pause where your body knows something your mind hasn't accepted yet. I checked the time. It was late enough that this call didn't make sense. Late enough that ignoring it would have been reasonable. Late enough that answering it meant I was stepping out of the night I had planned for myself. The phone kept ringing. I told myself it was probably nothing serious. I told myself it would be rude not to answer. I told myself I could hang up if it got uncomfortable. All of those thoughts arrived quickly, stacked on top of each other, giving me just enough cover to do the thing I was already leaning toward. I answered. There was no dramatic moment when I picked up the call, no rush of emotion, no sense that something irreversible had just happened. Just a quiet click, and then breathing on the other end. That's the part people don't talk about, the breathing before someone speaks. It tells you more than their words ever will. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything split into two versions of my life, the one where the phone kept ringing and the one where I answered. I think about that often now, not with panic, not with regret that burns, just with awareness, because sometimes the most important moments don't feel important when they happen. They only become heavy later when you finally understand what they took from you. Before that call, my life wasn't dramatic. I wasn't struggling in any obvious way. I wasn't unhappy enough to complain about it. I wasn't fulfilled enough to feel proud of it either. It was balanced in that fragile way, where nothing feels urgent but nothing feels meaningful. I had a routine that worked, not because I loved it, but because it didn't ask much from me. Wake up, get ready, go where I needed to go, come home tired in a way that didn't feel earned or deserved. The kind of tiredness that doesn't come from effort, but from repetition. People around me would have said I was doing fine. I paid my bills, I showed up on time. I answered messages when I was supposed to. From the outside, there was nothing wrong. And that matters, because when something eventually went wrong, everyone assumed it had been building for a long time, that I must have been reckless, that I must have been searching for an escape. I wasn't. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't bored enough to invite chaos into my life. If that phone hadn't rung, I would have gone to sleep that night the same way I always did, thinking about nothing in particular, expecting tomorrow to look exactly like today. That's what makes this harder to explain. Big changes don't always come from big dissatisfaction. Sometimes they come from comfort, from believing nothing significant is going to happen, from letting your guard down because everything feels manageable. That night felt manageable. I remember lying there before the phone rang, thinking about small, unimportant things, what time I needed to wake up, what I might eat the next day, whether I'd left something unfinished at work. Nothing heavy, nothing worth remembering. And yet everything I remember now seems to start there, right before the sound of the phone cut through the room. When I saw the name on the screen, it didn't shock me. That surprised me later. I expected to remember panic or confusion, or at least curiosity, but none of that came. What I felt instead was familiarity, not closeness, not warmth, just recognition. It was someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time, not because anything bad had happened between us. We simply drifted. Life moved in different directions. Messages slowed down. Conversations became shorter. Eventually, they stopped altogether. That happens more often than people admit. There are people who matter to you deeply at one point in your life, and then quietly stop being part of it, without a fight, without a final conversation, without any clear ending. This was one of those people. We shared a stretch of time together that had felt important when it was happening. Not dramatic, not intense, just present. And then, one day, that presence wasn't there anymore. I couldn't have told you exactly when the distance started. I only knew that it existed. Seeing their name that night brought all of that back in a single second. Not memories exactly, more like an emotional outline. I remembered who I was when they were around. I remembered how differently life felt then. And I think that's why I didn't hesitate as much as I should have. Part of me still associated them with a version of myself that felt simpler, less careful, less guarded. I didn't think they were calling to cause trouble. I didn't think they were calling because something had gone wrong. I thought they were calling because they trusted me. That assumption did more work than any explanation ever could. The phone kept ringing while all of this happened in my head. I hadn't consciously decided anything yet, but my hand was already holding the phone. I remember thinking that ignoring the call would feel like erasing something that had once mattered, and I wasn't ready to do that. So I answered, not because it made sense, not because it was responsible, but because it felt familiar. There was a pause after I answered. Not the kind of pause where the connection is bad, not the kind where someone is struggling to speak. It felt intentional. I could hear them breathing, slow, controlled. That should have unsettled me. Instead, it made me listen more closely. I almost said their name first, almost asked if everything was okay. But before I could, they spoke. They said my name, just once, quietly. No urgency, no emotion layered on top of it. That calmness was the first sign that this wasn't a casual call. People don't sound calm when they're uncertain. They sound calm when they've already decided what they need. They asked how I was. I answered automatically, the way you always do. Fine. They didn't comment on it. They didn't fill the silence with small talk. They just waited. That waiting did something to me. It made the call feel heavier than it should have. Eventually, they asked if I was busy. Not right now, they said. Tonight. I hesitated before answering. Not because I was busy, I wasn't, but because the question felt larger than it needed to be. I told myself that listening didn't mean committing. I told myself I could always back out later. I told myself this was just a conversation. And then, before I had fully decided anything, I heard myself say yes. It wasn't a strong yes. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was quiet, almost reluctant. But it was enough. The moment I said it, the tone of the call shifted. Not noticeably, not sharply, just enough that I could feel it. They sounded relieved, and that relief settled somewhere uncomfortable in my chest, because relief means responsibility has already been transferred. They thanked me. They gave me an address, and suddenly the night was no longer mine. After they gave me the address, there was another pause. Not the awkward kind, the settled kind, like a decision had just been finalized on both sides. I looked at the screen of my phone again, even though the call was still connected. The room around me hadn't changed. The light was still low. The air was still quiet. And yet the night no longer felt empty. There was a weight to it now. I remember thinking that I should ask more questions, not because I didn't trust them, but because nothing about the call was specific enough to make sense yet. I should have asked what exactly they needed help with. I should have asked why it had to be tonight. I should have asked if anyone else knew what was happening. Those questions lined up clearly in my mind, and then, one by one, I chose not to ask them. Part of me was afraid of the answers. Another part was afraid that asking would give me a reason to back out. It's strange how quickly we protect decisions we haven't even made yet. They started talking again, filling the silence with small details. Not explanations, just enough information to make the situation sound manageable. They said it wouldn't take long. They said they didn't need much from me. They said they just didn't want to do this alone. That last sentence stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt honest. Everyone has moments they don't want to face alone, and hearing someone admit that does something to you. It shifts the balance. I could have said no at that point. Nothing had been agreed to yet. Nothing had been acted on. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded to myself in the dark room as if they could see me, as if that gesture somehow made the decision more solid. I told them I would leave soon. They thanked me again. This time it didn't sound like relief. It sounded like certainty. After the call ended, I didn't move right away. I sat there on the edge of the bed, holding my phone, listening to the quiet return. The room felt different now. Not tense, not urgent, just altered. I told myself I could still change my mind. The call was over. Nothing physical had happened yet. That thought gave me comfort. I stood up slowly, more out of habit than intention. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street was empty. Lights glowed softly at a distance. Everything looked exactly the way it always did at that hour. The world wasn't reacting to my decision. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made the whole thing feel unreal. I went back to the bed and sat down again. I checked the time. It was late enough that leaving now would erase the boundary between today and tomorrow. Once I stepped outside, the night would no longer belong to rest. It would belong to whatever waited for me at that address. I remember thinking that if I stayed, nothing bad would happen. That's how I justified it. Not by convincing myself this was the right thing to do, but by convincing myself that leaving would be unnecessary. I changed clothes. Nothing special, just something comfortable. I picked up my keys and paused with them in my hand. That pause lasted longer than I expected. I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the room, and wondered when exactly this night had stopped being optional. I wondered when I had crossed the line between being asked for help and becoming responsible for whatever came next. I didn't find an answer, so I left. The door closed behind me softly, too softly for a moment that mattered this much. As I locked it, I had a brief, uninvited thought that if I didn't answer that call, I would already be asleep. That version of me was somewhere else now, and I wasn't sure I could get back to them. The air outside felt cooler than I expected. That happens late at night, when the day finally lets go of whatever warmth it was holding on to. I stood there for a moment after locking the door, keys still in my hand, listening. No footsteps, no distant voices, just the low, constant hum of the city resting. Getting into the car felt automatic. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I started driving. The streets were mostly empty. A few cars passed now and then, headlights briefly cutting through the darkness before disappearing again. I remember thinking how calm everything looked. There's something unsettling about moving through a quiet city at night. It feels like you're seeing a version of the world that isn't meant for you. Traffic lights changed on their own, storefronts reflected my headlights back at me. Nothing seemed aware that I was on my way to make a mistake. I tried to replay the call in my head, searching for details I might have missed, a warning in their voice, a hesitation I could have paid more attention to. But the memory felt smooth. Too smooth. That bothered me. Most harmless situations have rough edges. This one didn't. As I drove, I passed familiar intersections, places I'd been 100 times during the day. At night, they felt different. Smaller, quieter, like they were holding their breath. I checked the address again when I was a few minutes away. It wasn't unfamiliar. That was another detail I didn't like. Not because I knew exactly where it was, but because I knew the area well enough to understand that nothing good happened there late at night. I slowed down without realizing it. I told myself that was just caution, that being careful didn't mean I was scared. The truth was, I didn't want to arrive too quickly. There was a part of me that hoped something would interrupt this moment. A wrong turn, a closed road, a reason to delay. Nothing did. Eventually, I turned onto their street, and that was when the quiet changed. The building was darker than the others around it. Not abandoned, just subdued. Only one window was lit. I parked across the street and sat there longer than I needed to. The engine idled softly. I watched that single light, trying to decide what it meant. Lights tell stories at night. A brightly lit room feels different from a dim one. This light was low, controlled. It didn't feel like someone waiting impatiently. It felt like someone already deep into something. My phone buzzed. A message from them. I see you. That sentence shouldn't have felt the way it did, but it made my stomach tighten. I got out of the car. The sound of the door closing echoed louder than it should have in the empty street. Each step toward the building felt heavier than the last, not because I knew what I was walking into, but because I was beginning to understand that I didn't. They opened the door before I knocked. That too felt wrong. They smiled when they saw me. Not a wide smile, not forced, just relieved. That relief confirmed what I'd been trying to not think about. Whatever this was, it had already been happening before I arrived. I stepped inside. The air smelled different, stale. Not dirty, just unused, like the room had been closed off for a while. They locked the door behind me. The sound of the lock was soft, but it landed hard. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a small favor. Not because anything dangerous was happening, not because I felt threatened, but because the situation no longer felt optional. They started explaining more, slowly, carefully, and with every sentence the shape of the night changed. What they needed from me wasn't complicated, but it was significant. Significant enough that I should have said no immediately. Significant enough that I should have turned around the moment I understood it. Instead, I listened. And in that listening, I crossed another line. One I hadn't known was there. They finished explaining what they needed from me, and then they stopped talking. Not abruptly, just finished. The room felt smaller once the words were out in the open. Nothing about the request was illegal, nothing violent, nothing dramatic. That almost made it worse, because it meant the responsibility rested entirely on me. I stood there, trying to process the shape of what they were asking. trying to measure the cost. It wasn't the kind of thing you could undo easily. It wasn't the kind of help that stayed contained. If I agreed, it would spread outward, into conversations, into explanations, into future choices. I remember thinking, this is where I leave. Not as a command, as an observation. This was the moment that still belonged to me. They must have seen something change in my face because they spoke again. They said they understood if I didn't want to stay. They said they wouldn't be angry. They said they'd figure something else out. But the way they said it told a different story. It wasn't pressure. It wasn't manipulation. It was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from already knowing how few options you have left. That's what kept me there. I told myself that walking away wouldn't erase what they were dealing with. It would only move it out of my sight. I told myself that staying didn't mean I agreed with everything, that I could still draw boundaries. I told myself I was being practical. Those thoughts lined up quickly, forming a path that didn't require courage, only compliance. I took my jacket off and set it down. That small gesture felt heavier than any spoken agreement. Because once you settle into a space, leading becomes harder. They thanked me again. This time, I didn't respond.
What followed wasn't chaotic. That's the part people find hardest to understand. There were no raised voices, no sudden shifts, no moment where everything clearly went wrong. Things unfolded slowly. We talked. We waited. We made small decisions that felt insignificant on their own. Time moved differently in that room. Minutes stretched. Silences felt longer. I became aware of how alert my body was, even though nothing urgent was happening. My shoulders stayed tense. My thoughts kept circling back to the same question. When does this end? Eventually, it did. Not with relief, not with satisfaction, just completion. I left some time later. I don't remember checking the time. Outside, the street looked exactly the same as when I arrived. Quiet. Empty. That normality felt unreal. Driving home, I noticed how aware I was of everything. Street signs, reflections in windows, the sound of my own breathing. It felt like my senses had been turned up slightly too high. Over the next few days, the consequences began to show themselves. Not immediately, in subtle ways. Conversations felt different. I caught myself pausing before answering simple questions. I avoided certain topics without consciously deciding to. I became careful with details that had never mattered before. Nothing about my life looked different on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted. I had crossed a line that didn't exist until I stepped over it, and once you know where that line is, you can't unsee it. I started replaying the night in pieces. Not the dramatic moments, but the small ones. The pause before I answered the phone. The moment I picked up my keys. The second I took my jacket off. Those were the points where I could have left. Those were the points where the story could have ended differently. But it didn't. And now it lived with me. I don't think about that night every day. That surprises people when I tell them. They expect something louder, something heavier. But the truth is quieter than that. Most days, life looks exactly the same as it did before. the same routines, the same places, the same conversations that move forward without asking much of me. If you met me now, you wouldn't know anything had changed. And yet it has. What that night took from me wasn't safety, it wasn't peace, it was certainty. Before, there were moments I moved through without thinking, calls I answered, requests I agreed to, decisions that felt small enough to ignore. Now I pause, not because I'm wiser, not because I'm braver, but because I know how much weight can hide inside ordinary choices. I know how quiet a turning point can be. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the beginning of it. Not the drive, not the conversation, just the sound of the phone ringing in a dark room, the stillness before I picked it up. That version of me, the one who hadn't answered yet, feels very far away now. I don't miss them, but I recognize them. They lived in a world where things felt more predictable, where nights ended the way they were supposed to. I live in a world where I understand how easily that can change. There was no dramatic fallout from that call, no clean ending, just a quiet shift that settled into my life and stayed there. And maybe that's how most real stories end. Not with answers, not with resolution, but with awareness. Some nights after everyone sleeps, I sit with that awareness for a while, and then I let it rest.